So today's show is connected to last week's show on the real Dr. Martin Luther King. That show had a central focus on power, the power of the Black movement in the South, and particularly the power exerted by Southern Blacks to achieve two big breakthroughs: the Civil Rights Bill coming out of Birmingham and voting rights coming out of Selma, and the accumulated effect of the Black freedom movement in the U.S. with its support in the South, its support throughout the U.S. So these were significant achievements based on Blacks exercising power. And in last week's show, I pointed out that the San Francisco Freedom Movement, which was the only successful freedom movement or Black power movement in the North, that it was another example of the exercise of Black power. And I used it particularly to look at King's approach to organizing in urban communities in the North. And I'm going to stress that while I led this movement, that ain't why I'm stressing it. I'm stressing it because of its achievements, and it was a collective achievement. We had a team of people that made this come about. But the key point is, last week's discussion had a central focus on power and how Black folks can wield it to achieve both gains on a day-to-day basis to improve the lives of our people and long-term to produce liberation. So power was a central theme. So central to the discussion of power in the movements of the 60s was its shift to Black power. And while that wasn't the central point of discussion last week, it was an important part. And so I thought it was logical to continue this discussion, centering this time on Black power. And so today's show, as those of you who have received the promotional can see, today's show is entitled Black Power Part 1, Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, and Ghana's independence movement. So this is where we're going for this show. You'll see why I chose this topic, particularly focusing on Garvey, Nkrumah, and African independence, in particular, this case, Ghana's independence movement. Next week, the show will be Black Power Part 2, the Black Power movement of the 60s and its meaning for today. So why am I starting with Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, and Ghana's independence movement? I'm certainly not starting here because this was the beginning of Black power. We've been wielding Black power in the world for a very long time. Kemet was the greatest achievement of power for a nation, and just power and creative power in the history of the world. And as I pointed out before, the Twa laid the foundation for that. The founders of Kemet in what's called the pre-dynastic period were Anu people, agrarian Twa. And so while hunter-gatherer societies weren't the big societies that built power, the hunter-gatherer societies provided the vision for just power. And I would suggest when we're looking at this idea of restructuring this society, the most important thing we can draw from are just models. And the African models are, I think, of all, the most important because they are the most just on the planet. Not that all African societies were just. Get that straight. So I'm not focusing on Garvey and Nkrumah and the African independence movement, in this case in Ghana, because this was the first or second move towards Black power in the world. Um, and I'm certainly not going to start a discussion on Black power by going back to Kemet, because we don't need to put it under the category of Black power. Just looking at African history, it covers a whole lot. Because if I did that, then we would be having a series of courses on our history, which will we be doing over time. So the main reason that I'm taking this approach is because the Garvey movement and the African independence movement, particularly in Ghana, which was the first nation to achieve independence south of the Sahara in the 20th century, the Sudan being the first. And the main reason then for taking these two themes is to provide what I consider to be the best window for understanding the connection between national power and global power being wielded by African people. And one of the ways we confuse ourselves on the question of power, and this is one of the things that King raised when he made the point that I quoted last week, that they had not been trained, people in the movement had not been trained, he in particular, was an honest self-criticism to wield power. He was honest about it. So one of the ways you get some training in how to wield power is to understand the connection between your local, state, and national organizing and building of power to the global arena, because anything that's national is proceeding from the local, moving up to the national level. So how do these connect? And it's one of the best classrooms for understanding power. And it will also divest you of the notion that you're completely powerless, because we're going to see how one movement of Africans in the world affects another and affects global change in the world. And so it's a myth to think that you're powerless. And we'll go into that again in a minute. I've been given a lot of examples of that over the last year and 3 months. So this is especially important for the position of Africans in the world at the end of the 20th century throughout the 21st century, these connections that we'll be talking about today. It's only one, there are many others. So when we understand how the Garvey movement ties into African independence movements, we get a deep historical insight into Black power when it's effectively operating on the national stage. It can then trigger things that happen on the international stage. Note I say when it's effective, you know what I mean? And when we look at Garvey, his movement, that was a very effective movement and very powerful. And so this suggests that in understanding power, and in this case, Black power, the globe is a gigantic classroom. And just as I said about the movements for change in this country, you have two teachers. You have your people, and in this case, on the global level, the people of any part of the world you're studying and the forces they're going up against. And so when you see how power is exercised in that arena, then you have a better idea of how you can effectively exercise power where you are. And for me, I'm always looking at strategies, tactics that work in the world. And my books, The Art of Leadership, Volume 1 and 2, as I pointed out before, had 3 drafts. You could do this on a computer. First one was my experience then of 30 years of organizing. Now it's 62 years. And so that was the first level, my own personal experiences in successful organizing. Second level was our people's experience in this country in successful organizing. And then the third one was the experience of African people, people of color, and any people in the world who are struggling for just change and transformation under the rubric of liberation. And that's important because methods that work in one part of the world can be used to empower you in other parts. And in fact, I've given this example before. I wouldn't be alive and my members wouldn't be alive had I not been in Britain to pick up a book called Low Intensity and Peacekeeping Operations by General Kitson. And he had dismantled movements in Malaysia and the Mau Mau movement in Kenya, and had gone up against the Irish. He didn't beat them, but he went up against them. And then he wrote this book. When I got back to San Francisco State, because I couldn't buy the book in Britain, it wasn't available for sale, I pulled it out of our library as a professor and kept it for 20 years. And then later, my priest told me I had to return it because that was not right, even though I had the right to keep this book as long as I want. I'm a professor. I can do that. So I returned it, but I copied it first. Had I not studied this book, when the FBI ran low intensity operations on my group, they would have taken us out because that is an invisible move. That's their best move. Much better than COINTELPRO that they had run on me. So I was ready for it and kept our people alive as a result. So the globe is a classroom. And don't think that because somebody who's doing something ain't Black, you can't learn from it. As John Henry Clark often taught, African history is world history. You study yourself, but as his master, Arthur Schoenberg, had taught him to study the world first. And that ain't the way I started. But when I apprenticed under John, that's the first thing he did was give me some white people to study. I've been studying for years. Pointed this out before. He told me to read Decline of the West. I told him I had read all of Spengler's books, and then who's the author of Decline of the West. And then he told me to read the 6 volumes by Churchill, which is a lot of propaganda on what he did in World War II. And I read it, you know what I mean? So, but what John was really giving you a message on is African history operates in the context of the world. And if you want to know African history, you need to be studying world history as well. So this exercise into the theme for today, Black Power, Part 1, Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, and Ghana's independence movement is important because we're looking at the global connections and how what you're doing in one part of the world affects what you're doing in another part of the world. And you'll see you've been exercising quite a bit of power. And you can exercise more when you're better organized and more conscious of how this power works.